During World War II, the region came under Japanese occupation, sparking a nationalist resistance movement. At its forefront was the Viet Minh, a coalition led by Ho Chi Minh, a figure who would become synonymous with Vietnam's struggle for independence. After Japan's defeat, the Viet Minh declared Vietnam an independent nation, but France refused to relinquish its colony. This led to the First Indochina War, a brutal 8-year conflict between the French and the Viet Minh. In 1954, the French suffered a humiliating defeat at Dien Bien Phu, forcing them to withdraw. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh's communist forces controlled the north, while the south was led by Ngo Dinh Diem and supported by Western powers. This division was meant to be temporary, but Cold War tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union cemented it. America's leaders believed in the domino theory, the idea that if Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow. In the late 1950s, South Vietnam faced growing unrest. The Viet Cong, a communist insurgent group in the south, launched a campaign of guerrilla warfare aimed at overthrowing the government of Ngo Dinh Diem. To counter this, the United States began sending military advisors. Under President John F. Kennedy, U.S. involvement expanded significantly. Kennedy believed Vietnam was the front line in the global battle against communism. By 1963, over 16,000 American advisors were on the ground, but South Vietnam's government was plagued by corruption and instability. In 1963, President Diem was overthrown and assassinated in a coup supported by the U.S., plunging the country into further chaos. The turning point came in August 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. North Vietnamese patrol boats allegedly attacked U.S. Navy ships. The incident gave President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to escalate the war. In 1965, the first American combat troops arrived in Vietnam. Over the next 3 years, troop levels surged, reaching over 500,000. The U.S. relied on its technological superiority, deploying helicopters, jets, and advanced weaponry. But Vietnam would prove to be a different kind of war. The war on the ground in Vietnam was unlike anything American forces had ever experienced. The dense jungles of Southeast Asia, once thought to be impenetrable, now became the most dangerous battlefield imaginable. The dense canopy above shielded the enemy's movements, making it difficult for U.S. forces to track their adversaries. Viet Cong fighters would blend into the dense underbrush, leaving American soldiers vulnerable to sudden, violent attacks. Every step forward was fraught with peril. Traps and ambushes turned the jungle into a living nightmare. The sound of birds and insects would suddenly give way to the crack of gunfire. Firefights erupted suddenly and ended just as quickly. The jungle itself was a hostile force, draining the soldiers' stamina and will. American forces relied on air superiority to try and reclaim the jungle. Napalm and defoliants scarred the jungle, but the terrain always seemed to recover. The Viet Cong used their deep knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver U.S. forces. They disappeared into tunnels as quickly as they appeared. For U.S. soldiers, the jungle became an enemy in itself. Rivers and swamps turned every advance into an ordeal. Snakes, insects, and disease became constant threats. Ambushes struck without warning, leaving chaos in their wake. The Viet Cong could vanish into the jungle as quickly as they attacked. Even superior firepower couldn't overcome the jungle's natural defenses. The jungle absorbed every sound, turning the environment eerily quiet. Every shadow and rustle became a potential threat. The Viet Cong turned the jungle into their greatest weapon. U.S. soldiers learned to adapt, but the cost was high. The psychological toll of the jungle war was immense. Despite their best efforts, the jungle always seemed to fight back. The Viet Cong's resolve remained unbroken. For U.S. soldiers, the jungle became a symbol of a war with no clear end. Firefights were brutal, sudden, and disorienting. Every step forward felt like entering the unknown. Helicopters became lifelines in the dense jungle terrain, but even air support couldn't fully penetrate the jungle's depths. The jungle swallowed everything sound sight. The enemy's adaptability was unmatched. American soldiers began to dread every mission into the jungle. The jungle was more than a battlefield, it was an enemy itself. The Viet Cong's mastery of the terrain turned the war into a game of survival. Even with technology, the jungle remained undefeated. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army used guerrilla tactics, striking quickly, then vanishing back into the jungle or underground. For U.S. troops, every step was fraught with danger. Booby traps, ambushes, and sniper fire were constant threats. Every soldier knew that any shadow, any rustle of leaves could mean an enemy attack. They were fighting against a shadow army, one that would never face them head-on. The Viet Cong struck without warning, and the jungle swallowed them whole. For the Americans, the jungle itself felt like an accomplice to the enemy. Even the ground beneath them could be a hidden danger. Guerrilla tactics turned the battlefield into a game of survival. Fighting an enemy they couldn't see left soldiers constantly on edge. The Viet Cong used every advantage the jungle offered. Underground tunnels gave them a way to move undetected and strike anywhere. For U.S. troops, it was a war of constant uncertainty. The enemy's ability to vanish made victory feel impossible. Every soldier felt the weight of fighting a war where the enemy was nowhere. The Viet Cong's mastery of guerrilla tactics made them a shadow army. Sniper fire from unseen positions created a constant sense of vulnerability. Ambushes happened when least expected, leaving chaos in their way. The jungle's dense vegetation concealed every danger, turning it into a battlefield of shadows. The Viet Cong's strategy was simple: strike quickly and disappear. The Americans were forced to adapt to this unconventional warfare. Helicopters became lifelines, but they were also vulnerable. The jungle provided endless opportunities for ambushes. For U.S. soldiers, survival became a daily battle. Every sound in the jungle carried a potential threat. The jungle itself became a weapon against the Americans. The Viet Cong were relentless, striking and retreating without hesitation. The Americans struggled to adapt to a war they couldn't see. Victory felt impossible when the enemy could vanish into thin air. Every patrol was a gamble with life and death. The Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics were designed to disorient and demoralize. For every soldier, fear became their constant companion. The Viet Cong blended seamlessly with their surroundings. The jungle offered no comfort, only danger. The Viet Cong turned the Americans' superior firepower against them. Fighting a war in the jungle was a battle against the unknown. The Viet Cong never fought on the Americans' terms. The jungle itself seemed alive, aiding the Viet Cong at every turn. For the Americans, Vietnam was a war of shadows and unseen enemies. The Viet Cong had an elaborate system of tunnels stretching across South Vietnam. These tunnels were their lifeblood, used to move troops, hide supplies, and even house entire families. The tunnels were filled with traps, and U.S. soldiers often found themselves fighting an unseen enemy underground. Even the air was thick with the stench of damp earth and the sounds of distant explosions above. The tunnels were built to withstand everything the Americans could throw at them. Hidden entrances allowed them to vanish without a trace. For the Americans, entering the tunnels was a terrifying and dangerous task. The Viet Cong knew every passage, every turn, making them impossible to outmaneuver. The tunnels were more than just a hideout, they were a way of life. The Americans tried to destroy the tunnels, but the Viet Cong always rebuilt them. Every step underground was filled with the threat of traps. The tunnels allowed the Viet Cong to strike and then disappear. Even as American bombs fell above, the tunnels offered protection and mobility. For U.S. soldiers, the tunnels symbolized the frustration of fighting an invisible enemy. The Viet Cong's tunnels turned the barrier into a weapon. The Americans would learn that fighting underground was unlike any battle they had faced before. In January 1968, during the Vietnamese New Year or Tet, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched one of the largest coordinated offensives of the entire war. The Tet holiday, traditionally a time of peace and celebration, became the backdrop for chaos and violence. The offensive caught U.S. and South Vietnamese forces off guard, striking during a time when many were unprepared for battle. Over 100 cities, towns, and military installations in South Vietnam came under simultaneous attack. Explosions shattered the early morning calm as Viet Cong forces launched their first wave of assaults. Major cities like Saigon and Hue were turned into battlegrounds as the fighting spread. The attack on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon became a symbol of the offensive's audacity. Viet Cong fighters breached the embassy compound, igniting a fierce battle that shocked the world. Fighting in the streets of Saigon became intense, with both sides sustaining heavy casualties. In the ancient city of Hue, the Tet Offensive triggered one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the war. Entire neighborhoods in Hue were reduced to rubble as U.S. and South Vietnamese forces fought to reclaim the city. North Vietnamese troops fortified positions within Hue's historic citadel, turning it into a stronghold. The Viet Cong used the element of surprise to strike deep into South Vietnamese territory. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, their lives turned upside down. Many civilians sought shelter wherever they could, while others fled their homes entirely. The scale and coordination of the Tet Offensive overwhelmed South Vietnamese defenses. U.S. forces scrambled to respond, sending reinforcements to critical areas under siege. Helicopters ferried troops to hot zones, their rotors kicking up smoke and debris from burning buildings. The sheer scope of the offensive shattered the illusion that victory was near for the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. Despite heavy casualties, the Tet Offensive revealed the determination and resilience of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. Many attacks were repelled, but the damage to morale and perception was already done. The battle for Hue became a symbol of the war's cost in lives and destruction. Entire blocks of Hue were reduced to rubble, and the fight dragged on for weeks. Mass graves were discovered in Hue, evidence of brutal purges carried out by the Viet Cong during their occupation. The Tet Offensive demonstrated the North Vietnamese's ability to strike anywhere, anytime. For many Americans, images of destruction marked the turning point in war support. Though a military defeat for the Viet Cong, it became a propaganda victory that eroded U.S. confidence. Protests against the war intensified as Americans questioned whether victory was achievable. It showed the Vietnam War was far from over and that sacrifices would only continue to escalate in the years ahead. The Tet Offensive remains one of the most significant events of the Vietnam War, reshaping its course and legacy. The Tet marked the beginning of greater doubts about achieving victory and signaled a turning point in how the Vietnam War would ultimately unfold over the years. While soldiers fought on the front lines in Vietnam, the war at home raged in the streets of America. The draft, which disproportionately affected working-class families and minorities, sent countless young men to fight a war they didn't fully understand. In response, young Americans, especially college students, began to organize massive protests against the war. College campuses became epicenters for anti-war activism. Protesters used art, music, and speeches to rally against the Vietnam War, Chants of "Hell no, we won't go" echoed across the nation. The draft card burning became a powerful symbol of resistance. Police often clashed with protesters, leading to violent confrontations. Many Americans supported the protests, while others viewed them as unpatriotic. Protesters drew inspiration from the civil rights movement. Veterans returning from Vietnam joined the protests, adding powerful voices to the movement. Televised coverage of the protests brought the movement into millions of American homes. The protests symbolized growing discontent with the government's handling of the war. Many young Americans felt they were being sacrificed for a war they didn't believe in. Protests escalated, drawing massive crowds in major cities like New York, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. Women played a significant role in the anti-war movement. Musicians used their art to protest the war, inspiring a generation. Some protesters faced arrest, imprisonment, or violence for their actions. Anti-war protests became larger and more confrontational. What began as small student-led protests at college campuses quickly escalated. At first, these protests were peaceful but passionate. Signs read "Make love, not war, and bring our troops home." College campuses became centers of activism, spreading the message nationwide. By 1967, protests were no longer confined to universities. In October 1967, the movement reached a turning point. Over 100,000 demonstrators gathered to demand an end to the war. The protesters came from all walks of life: students, veterans, and ordinary citizens. Speakers rallied the crowd with impassioned calls for peace. Demonstrators held their ground, chanting and singing in unison. Many carried flowers, using peaceful symbols to counter the violence of war. Armed troops were deployed to manage the massive protest. The images of students clashing with armed troops shocked the nation. Some demonstrators pushed forward, confronting the soldiers head-on. Skirmishes broke out as tensions escalated between the two sides. Students threw flowers and chanted calls for peace, refusing to be silenced. Police and military forces moved in to disperse the crowd. Clouds of tear gas hung in the air as protesters fled. Others stood their ground, sitting in protest or locking arms to resist removal. Television cameras captured every moment of the confrontation. These images were broadcast into homes across the nation. For many, it was their first glimpse of the scale of anti-war protests. The protests fueled outrage among those already skeptical of the war. Solidarity spread among anti-war groups across the country. The confrontation at the Pentagon became a rallying cry for the anti-war movement. It showed the determination of those who demanded change. The government's use of force deepened the divide in American public opinion. To some, the protesters were heroes standing up for justice. To others, they were viewed as unpatriotic troublemakers. But the images of peaceful demonstrators clashing with armed troops were undeniable. The protests exposed the growing tension between generations. The movement gained momentum as support for the war began to erode. The Pentagon protest became one of the most iconic events of the anti-war movement. It sent a message that the American people were deeply divided over the war in Vietnam. The protesters had made their voices heard, and the world was listening. Peaceful or confrontational, the protests reflected a changing America. For those on the front lines at home, the fight against the war had only just begun. The Pentagon protest would forever symbolize the struggle for peace during a time of war. And for many Americans, it was a turning point they would never forget. By the early 1970s, it was clear that the war could not be won. The cost, both in terms of lives lost and political fallout, had become too great. Anti-war protests continued to grow in size and intensity across America. American families, Grieved as the number of casualties climbed higher and higher, under mounting pressure, President Richard Nixon sought a way to end the war. In 1969, he introduced Vietnamization, a strategy designed to shift the burden of combat to South Vietnamese forces. The goal was to gradually withdraw American troops from Vietnam. At the same time, South Vietnamese forces were expected to take on greater combat responsibilities. Vietnamization aimed to prepare South Vietnam to defend itself independently. The strategy was met with skepticism, both at home and abroad. Critics doubted that South Vietnamese forces could stand against the North on their own. American troops continued to leave Vietnam in waves. Each withdrawal was accompanied by public announcements and fanfare. For the soldiers leaving Vietnam, the mood was one of relief and uncertainty. Back home, their return was often met with indifference or hostility. Despite Nixon's assurances, the fighting in Vietnam continued. The North Vietnamese launched relentless attacks. Testing the resolve of the South, reports from the battlefield painted a grim picture of the conflict. Casualties continued to mount, even as the U.S. presence diminished. The policy of Vietnamization was deeply polarizing. Supporters believed it was a step toward peace with honor. Opponents saw it as an excuse to abandon South Vietnam to its fate. Despite the criticism, Nixon remained committed to the plan. Vietnamization required significant investments in training and equipment. Billions of dollars were spent bolstering the South Vietnamese military. Yet, many doubted whether South Vietnam could sustain itself without U.S. support. As American troops withdrew, the South Vietnamese military struggled to maintain control. The North Vietnamese intensified their efforts, sensing an opportunity. In the U.S., public opinion continued to turn against the war. The anti-war movement gained even more momentum as troop withdrawals increased. For many Americans, Vietnamization signaled the beginning of the end of the war. However, South Vietnamese forces were left to face a formidable enemy alone. The policy ultimately prolonged the conflict rather than ending it. By the mid-1970s, the fall of Saigon became inevitable. Nixon's vision of peace with honor remained unfulfilled. Vietnamization highlighted the limits of U.S. power abroad. For the South Vietnamese, the war ended in devastation. Vietnamization remains one of the most controversial strategies of the war. It marked a turning point in America's approach to global conflicts, and it left a legacy of lessons learned at great cost. Millions lost their lives during this war, and it is important to remember the sacrifices that were made and to be grateful of the America we know today. Thank you so much for watching this video. And if you enjoyed, like and subscribe so you never miss an upload on our channel. It took a lot of effort to make this, and more videos like this will be made. See you in the next video.